Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. Don't forget to subscribe. And today, we're talking about the Apple Podcasts app because apparently it's the latest phishing method. And Joseph Cox of 404 Media had a really good write-up on this in the first person, so I'm cribbing from him, and obviously I'm doing this in the third person. But something is very strange, and it's happening with basically the podcast app from Apple, as I mentioned. So over the last several months, Cox found that both the iOS, iPhone, iPad, and Mac versions, meaning your MacBook, of the podcast app would open religion, spirituality, and educational podcasts with no rhyme or reason, meaning he wasn't looking for these, they just started launching and playing. So sometimes Cox would unlock his machine and the podcast app would launch itself and then present him with one of these podcasts that were kind of bizarre. On top of that, at least one of these podcast pages in the app included a link to a potentially malicious website. So sometimes those podcasts did have actual audio. One was a religious sermon. Some were completely silent. And oftentimes these podcasts are years old, but for some reason they're now being shown to Joseph Cox. So Patrick Wardle, he's a Mac OS security expert and the creator of the Mac-focused cybersecurity organization Objective-C, said, and I quote, "The most concerning behavior is that the app can be launched automatically with a podcast of the attacker's choosing. I've replicated similar behavior, albeit via a website. Simply visiting a website is enough to trigger podcast to open and load a podcast of the attacker's choosing. And unlike other external app launches on Mac OS, like Zoom, for example, no prompt or user approval is required." In other words, probably because it's an Apple product, these are remote commands that are basically randomly launching the podcast app and then playing whatever the attacker wants. Now, to caveat this straight away, it's not that alarming. This isn't the biggest hack or the issue in the world, but it's really weird behavior, and Apple has not responded to any requests for comments for months that Cox has been basically requesting of them. Now, one of the podcasts is trying to direct listeners to a site that attempts to perform what is called a cross-site scripting attack, or XSS. Now, cross-site scripting is basically when an attacker injects their own malicious code into a website that looks otherwise legit, and cross-site scripting by default isn't going to infect you, but it could take you to a site that might, or try to steal your info, etc., etc. And so, Mac people, heads up, you get infected, for the record. Don't think you don't. And we've got evidence here of basically malicious behavior on Joseph Cox of 404's Media's site, and apparently others have been complaining about this as well, per the reviews that he had. So just heads up to you, if you use Apple Podcasts and you're on an iPhone or basically a MacBook, if it starts giving you weird behavior, sermons from years ago, or silent podcasts that you didn't look for, you might want to make sure that you've got good threat detection on your Mac and you are checking for these kinds of things. But these problems aren't going away, and the more applications in general become interconnected with the host operating systems, the more we should be seeing the ability to basically intervene, meaning if it's going to launch, it should be prompting us to say, yes, you do, Nick, me, want you to launch the podcast app or whatever it is. And quite frankly, a lot of these are so integrated, or we simply ignore it and say, yeah, just launch every time, and it gets us into trouble. We need filtering in our lives, whether it's opening up an application, whether it's downloading something and making sure it's checked for threat as it's being downloaded before we open it, etc., etc. So take that for what it's worth, but that is your interesting and concerning news of the day. So Apple Podcast listeners, you know what to do. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, please, please attempt to stay private, informed, and secure. Take care.